Hello, Royal History Geeks. It's Gareth here. I'm back, but more importantly, you're back. Thank you for joining us again. Okay, so today we are discussing Katherine of Aragon, the first wife and first queen of Henry VIII, so one of six. And we are asking the question whether or not she was a virgin when she married Henry and became his queen in 1509. Some of you will know exactly why we're asking that question and why it's significant. Others of you may be saying, well, what a strange question to ask. Why are we asking that, particularly of her rather than anybody else? So here's a little bit of background. So Henry VIII, the famous King of England, perhaps the most famous King of England to have ever reigned, had married in 1509 Katherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess. The Tudors had been very keen historically on a union between the heir to the House of Tudor of England and of the Spanish kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, who collectively together ruled the Kingdom of Spain. They would be powerful allies, but also the fact that an international power such as Spain was prepared to recognise the House of Tudor was a real boon, because at that time the House of Tudor was still trying to establish its legitimacy to a certain extent in the eyes of the world. So Henry, to cut a long story short, can't speak today, marries Catherine of Aragon as soon as he becomes king. He's a young man. He's just 18 years of old. She is 6 years younger than him, and for some years they live happily as man and wife. But they do have problems, and the most pressing problem is that they do not produce a male heir. They do have children. They have a number of children. Catherine is constantly pregnant in the early years of her marriage, but sadly, most of them are miscarried, don't come to term, or die stillborn, or die soon after being born. The one exception is the Princess Mary, who is born and who thrives and is the apple of the eye of both of her parents. But, as you may have noticed, clues in the name, was a girl. And the problem for Henry VIII, is that he wants a son. There's a number of reasons for that. It's partly a macho thing. Real men had sons, and there's an aspect of how he didn't want to seem anything less than the perfect specimen of manliness. But also, perhaps slightly more to his credit, he didn't. No woman had ever ruled England before. There had never been an undisputed female ruler of his kingdom, and he was very aware. He was someone who grew up in the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, and he did know exactly what could go wrong in a kingdom if whoever sat on the throne did not do so securely. If there was a weakness or a perceived weakness in the person that sat on the throne, it could be detrimental for the commonweal, for the good of the whole kingdom. So Henry starts to grow more and more concerned about this in the 1520s, and then thinks, hang on a minute, what is the reason that I don't have a son? Could the reason be that I am not really married and that God is punishing me for that? And you might be like, what? Well, here's the bit that I didn't mention earlier, which is very significant. Catherine originally came to England not to marry Henry. She originally came in 1501 to marry his brother Arthur, who was generally known in history as Arthur, the Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, who was the Tudor Rose, the heir to England. So Catherine marries him in 1501, but sadly, when she's only 16, Arthur's only 15. Sadly, he dies very soon after their marriage, and as such, everyone say, well, what do we do now with Catherine? And it was soon decided, well, hang on a minute, wouldn't it just make sense if Catherine's already here? Why doesn't she, do we all want the marriage? Why doesn't she marry Henry, Arthur's brother, who's now the heir to the throne? He's now the Prince of Wales. Why doesn't she marry him? I won't go into this now, but for various reasons that doesn't happen during the remainder, the remaining 8 years of the reign of King Henry VII, and it's actually quite a hard time for Catherine for a number of reasons. However, when Henry VIII does come of age, and coincidentally becomes king at exactly the same time that he comes of age, he does decide to marry Catherine. So Henry starts to think in the 1520s, hang on a minute, Arthur was my brother, Catherine was married to Arthur, I have therefore committed adultery, because by the standards of the day, if someone had been intimate with your sibling, that made them, in terms of church canon law, that made them your sibling. So Henry, by being in a pretend marriage, as he was as coming to see it with his brother's wife, made him guilty both of adultery and made him guilty of incest. So no wonder he thought God is not blessing this union with sons. Way back when Arthur had first died, and it was originally suggested that Catherine should marry Henry, the Pope had granted dispensation to say, don't worry about the fact you're technically brother and sister. I'm doing away with that. I am dispensing that, so it's absolutely fine for you to have this marriage. Popes did that all the time. There are a number of weddings because these degrees of affinity which prevented people married weren't just brother sister, they extended into cousins. So if any people from, say, the nobility were marrying someone who was a second, third cousin, which of course they did all the time because there weren't that many noble specimens around in England, and indeed in equivalent European powers over the seas, they would apply to the Pope for dispensation. Generally speaking, the Pope would grant them, and the wedding could go place, and nobody worried about the canon law implications of that. But Henry starts to think, hang on a minute, maybe the Pope overreached himself. Actually, if by the rule of the Bible, if by the rule of God, this marriage was incestuous, I don't think the Pope had any right to say to say that he could dispense or do away with it. I have married my brother's wife. I'm guilty of incest. I'm guilty of adultery, and as such, God has not blessed me with sons. This union should be therefore dissolved, so that I can marry again, have a son, please God. Oh, and as luck would have it, at around about this same time, Henry started to fall in love with another woman called Anne Boleyn, and he would decided he would much rather marry her instead. I don't want to go down this path now, but it should be noted, Henry, I think, did start to have these doubts before Anne Boleyn came on the scene, so we can't put all the blame on Anne in terms of whispering these doubts into Henry's ear, although of course she was a huge factor as they fell deeper and deeper in love. So Henry starts to pursue this. He gets his top people, his lawyers, his ministers onto this and say, this dispensation wasn't valid. Catherine is Arthur's husband, not mine. We need to recognise this as no marriage at all and let me marry again. But Catherine comes along, throws a spanner in the works, and she says, no, hang on a minute. Arthur and I were never physically intimate. Arthur and I never had sex. The marriage was never consummated. So, even if the Pope had no right to authorise the dispensation, although people did believe in the Pope's right to dispense of these things. But even if the Pope had no right to do that, the whole process was unnecessary anyway, because Arthur and I were never really man and wife. We hadn't slept together, we hadn't consummated the marriage, we weren't married. And for most people, they would agree. They would say, yeah, if you haven't slept together, then you weren't married anyway. No issue. Henry and Catherine are married. Henry cannot divorce Catherine. Henry cannot go off with Anne Boleyn. Henry cannot go and find the son that he so desperately wants, or sire the son he so desperately wants. Henry, as you can imagine, was none too pleased by this. So a whole debate and process of investigation begins around the question of, is Catherine telling the truth? Was her marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, really unconsummated? And historians have been trying to find out the truth ever since. As you can imagine, there's a fundamental problem with this kind of question, and that is that only two people, both of whom are long dead, one of whom was dead by the time anyone started asking the question, only two people have ever known the answer to whether that marriage was consummated. Uh, and so, frankly, anyone now that claims to be able to tell you the answer with 100% certainty is, well, their views need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because only two people know, and they are both dead. However, that doesn't mean there is nothing we can go on, and we can speculate and we can weigh various different strands of evidence against one another. So when this question started to be asked in earnest, two, if you like, official evidence gathering sessions were called. One in England, where the people who were with Catherine and Arthur were asked about what happened when, I should say, Catherine and Arthur were in Wales, because Arthur was the Prince of Wales. So they, as soon as they were married, they were dispatched off to Wales. They're away from the eyes of the main court, therefore. So it was all the advisors, stewards, household members, maids, servants that were with them that were now being asked about what had happened in the early days of Catherine and Arthur's marriage. So there was one set of proceedings happening in England, and another that was happening in Spain, because Catherine was a Spanish princess. Her nephew was King of Spain, but also Holy Roman Empire and Emperor, and understandably quite keen to defend his aunt's honour and the honour of their family. So there are two different proceedings in Spain, and unsurprisingly, the one in England, his evidence suggesting that Catherine and Arthur had consummated their marriage. The one in Spain, his evidence suggesting that they had not consummated their marriage. So some of the men that had been close manservants of Arthur, Prince of Wales, Willoughby being the most obvious one, testified that when Arthur came out of his chamber after having been put to bed with Catherine the night before, he came out bragging that he needed a cup of ale because he had spent the night in the midst of Spain, which, as they knew, was a hot region. You know, all very saucy, all very infancy. That he'd had a passionate night of love making, other remarks that he talked about marriage being thirsty work, etc., all giving everybody the impression that the marriage had been consummated. However, the people testifying in Spain, servants that had been with Catherine, including doctors, including maids who would have had intimate conversations with Catherine the day after, were saying that Arthur was not this lusty prince that he may be being portrayed in England. He was very ill. He was very small for his age, and that Catherine had said after their wedding night and other occasions that there'd be no consummation. He wasn't physically up to it. He wasn't able to do the job. Both these pieces of evidence are understandably very tricky for us. They were both, in one sense, both sets of witnesses were telling the people of that they're being inquisited by what they wanted to hear. So the people running proceedings in England wanted to hear that the marriage had been consummated. The people running them in Spain were wanting to hear that, of course, that they weren't. So it's very difficult to know what to do. Having said that, despite the political pressures they were both under, everyone would have been swearing under oath. People were concerned about the implications of lying under oath. People are, of course, concerned about that today, but far more so 500 years ago, where people really, really believed that one day they would have to meet their maker and give an account for every lie that they told, particularly if it were under oath. I'm not suggesting people don't believe that today. Of course, many, many do, and many variations of that, but it was the ubiquitous, universally held belief in the era that we are talking about. So we shouldn't just dismiss the evidence as being lies just because it was politically convenient for those people to be saying what they were saying to the people that were asking the questions. However, when we listen to what was being said, I think there's two things that we need to bear in mind. I suspect it's quite likely that Arthur did come out making remarks suggesting he'd had a heady night of lovemaking. And in fact, the words that he uses, fetch me a cup of ale, because I have this night been in the midst of Spain, which, as you know, is a hot region. You can hear a 15-year-old boy saying that. It's entirely believable to me that that's exactly what happened. However, having been a 15-year-old boy, quite a long time ago now, having met other 15-year-old boys, I think we can also have a fairly high degree of caution. Um, let's say we can recognise the disconnect between what a 14-year-old lad might say about his exploits and what might actually have happened. On the other hand, the people testifying in Spain were giving a remarkably consistent account of Arthur's physical description, and these people had not been, all of them, together for the 20 odd years leading up to that trial. Or that hearing, that inquest. They had been, they hadn't been all living in the same household. They hadn't all been comparing notes. There wouldn't have been an awful lot of time to prepare and get their story straight. And they're giving a remarkable consistency to Arthur's physical limitations. And of course, if that is correct, if Arthur was in that kind of physical weakness, vulnerability, then doesn't it make it even more likely that he will have been youthfully bragging about his exploits when he comes out the chamber? After all, let's be honest, if he maybe did his best but wasn't quite able to do the job, he is very unlikely to have come out the next day and said, bad luck, lads, did our best, didn't quite cut the mustard, maybe tomorrow night. It's much more believable that he would have been corrective in the information he gave, and perhaps gave people the saucy banter that they were looking for. We don't know, but that's just how it feels to me. There are a couple of other points that are worth considering. One is that there was a gap of time, and lots of people latch onto this, between Arthur's death and the proclamation of Henry, the future Henry VIII, as Prince of Wales, which is, as you know, was then, as it is now, the title traditionally given to the heir to the throne. And of course, people say, well, that gap was to see if Catherine was pregnant. Because if Catherine was pregnant, that new child would be the heir to the throne, not Prince Henry. Therefore, we shouldn't make him Prince of Wales just yet, because that's a title that only goes to the heir to the throne, which Prince Henry may not yet be. It's possible, but it seems unlikely that is really the reason. It could just frankly be a mark of respect to Arthur to give it a little bit of space in between. I mean, certainly when you hear vivid accounts of how Henry VII and Elizabeth of York comforted each other after, they talk about the need for them to have more children. They don't say, oh, but hang on a minute, there could be a child, there could be another heir in our daughter-in-law's belly. That you don't hear much talk of that. So I don't think that's an awful lot to go on. And the other problem we really have with this whole debate is it kind of comes down to who do you trust more between Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon. And that's a really tricky way to do history. And it's not a way I like to do history at all. Because the truth is, however much we feel we know these characters, and we do in the Tudor era have a wealth of source material that we don't necessarily have for certainly from 100 years before it. But we still don't know. I mean, if you look now, I mean, if you compare political leaders today, even those like Tony Blair or Boris Johnson, which have got a very strongly perceived public personality, you still hear that when people meet them, they're surprised. They say, oh, he was much nicer than I thought he'd be. He was much sharper than I thought he'd be. He was drier than I thought he'd be. He was taller. He was shorter. All of those things. And that's in our own time, where we have stuff written and leaked and gossiped and published about them all the time. Day in, day out, we still know them, their personalities and their characters to a tiny, tiny degree, and we often get completely the wrong idea of their characters and personalities. So I'm very worried about doing that with historical figures. Having said that, we do know that both were stubborn. Henry, I think, had genuine doubts about the legitimacy of his marriage. I think they very quickly came a tool to suit a bigger purpose, which was his marriage to Anne Boleyn. But I think his doubts were rooted in the years before he had any interest in Anne, and I think that those doubts were real. Catherine was stubborn too. She was proud. She'd come to England to do one job, and that was to be Queen of England, and she was unlikely to let anything get in the way of that, and she was unlikely to be knocked off her perch too easily once she'd cemented herself there. All that said, I think there are two reasons why I am more likely to believe Catherine than Henry. The first is that Catherine maintains to the end of her life that she is Henry's true wife and the rightful Queen of England, including in the hours before her death. As I said earlier, this was an era where people, and Catherine very much believed this, where people believed that when they died they were going to meet their maker and give an account for everything they'd done and said. Therefore, to maintain that lie so close to the end of her life, when she thought she was so close to having that divine conversation, it seems to me unlikely that she would have persisted. Like I say, that's not an unqualified endorsement of what Catherine is saying. It could be that she convinced herself. People do that. People's minds play tricks on them when they're determined to prove something. They misremember situations. That is a possibility. That can't be discounted. But the other thing that I think counts in Catherine's favour is when she herself had to give evidence to the proceedings, which were technically against Henry, but really they were against her. She swore there that she was the true wife of Henry, that she'd come to him untouched by man, and she challenges Henry directly to say that he knows that's true. She implies that there is a reason why Henry would know that to be true, and for him to be honest about that. I don't want to delve too much into what may or may not have happened on Catherine and Henry's wedding night, but we do know that when a woman who has been untouched by man before first consummates a union, there can be physical signs of that, and of course these were these were the same physical signs, in fact, that Henry's people had been searching for when Catherine married Arthur, and they didn't discover any true evidence of them. So if Catherine is saying that there were reasons why Henry would know that she was telling the truth in a public forum, again under oath, and with Henry being directly challenged by her, it seems very galling that she would do that if she didn't have pretty good reason to be sure that she knew what she was saying was the truth, which of course, barring her brain playing tricks on her, she did. So it's for those reasons that I'm inclined to side with Catherine on this over Henry. But like I say, we don't know. I can't know. You can't know either. Because only two people knew, and they are lost to us. Thank you very much for joining me again. Do sign up to follow the channel if you want to get alerts and things when these come out. Also on my website, royalhistorygeeks.com. I've set up a newsletter function now. I'm going to start doing monthly or so newsletters, so sign up to that if you want to start getting those, and you can keep up to date with what we're talking about. But join the conversation below, put some comments in the comment section, let me know what you think. There is other evidence, by the way, that I've not gone into. It's already been a nearly 25-minute video. There's more that could have gone into, so feel free to pick it up in the discussion. And till next time, stay safe and stay well.